Hello everybody, today we're going to look at the beginning of the Russian course. So we're looking at this section of Tsarist Russia 1855 to 1894, Autocracy and the Condition of Russia in 1855. And this links in with one of the key questions. The first of the key questions: how was Russia governed and how did political authority change and develop? So this really is setting the scene. I'm going to give you a bit of insight into what Russia was like at the beginning of our time period. Now, what we're looking at is this bullet point on political authority in the state of Russia, and hopefully I'm going to take you through these three stages, from not knowing anything about it to blowing your minds with some of the incredible stuff that was going on. And it really is a really interesting and different world, Russia in the 19th century. And to at the end of this, you'll feel thumbs up, you'll be really happy, you'll be going, right, I get it, I know something about it now. So that's our aim for this video. Right, so we're going to start with the idea of Russian autocracy. So an autocracy is when somebody has absolute power and control. Now, the word Tsar, and the Tsars were the people in charge in Russia, means emperor. It actually derived from the Old Latin Caesar. And the Romanovs had been the family in charge of Russia going back to 1613. The time frame we start off with is a crossover in between Nicholas I, who dies in 1855, and his son Alexander II, who replaces him. Now, as we see in material that we're going to look at later on in future videos, we'll see that Alexander II was a reformer. He started to bring in change, but the actual situation in 55 was one before that had happened. Now, the position of the Tsar was a really significant one in Russia. Often affectionately referred to as the Little Father, essentially the Tsar was seen as in like a parental position towards the Russian people. It was his job to protect Russia and its people, but it was their obligation to obey him. Now, often this kind of special position in people's minds that the Tsar had meant when there was corruption and there was abuse of power and things went wrong and people were treated badly, people went, I wish the Tsar knew about this. You could do something about it. And the Tsar was generally not blamed. Local officials were blamed, inefficient practices were blamed, but not the Tsar themselves. So the Tsar had absolute power. They were the only person who could make new laws. There were ministers in the government, but they were merely advisors. The Tsar was free to ignore their advice and could fire them at any time. There was no parliament, no elections, and therefore no democracy in Russia at this point in time. The Tsar was also commander-in-chief of the armed forces and was head of the Russian Orthodox Church, and was believed by the Russian people to have been divinely appointed by God. So the Tsar's power is not only political, it is also military, and it is also religious. So we've got complete power essentially over almost all aspects of the Russian people's lives. Now, this power concentrated in the wrong hands is going to cause massive problems. And there is an old saying that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And we will see a degree of that with some of our Tsars. Right. So that's autocracy. So let's think about some of the key groups and institutions in Russia at this time. Well, underneath the Tsar is the nobility. Now, they're a tiny proportion of the population, about 1 or 2%. They are incredibly wealthy. They are landowners. They own huge swathes of land. The Russian Empire is a gigantic place. And they would collect the taxes for the Tsar. They would raise armies for him. And the nobles and their sons then would hold all the senior positions in the army, in the bureaucracy. They were the provincial governors, the commandants of towns, the leading civil servants. And it was birth, not ability, that dictated who got what jobs. So whilst in Western Europe, places like Britain, they were moving towards a meritocracy, where you got positions based on your ability, in Russia it wasn't. It was based on where you were in the nobility. Having said that, Nicholas I was keen to ensure that the sons of nobles were well educated. He doubled the places of university between 1836 and 1848, and these educated sons started to bring ideas into the Tsarist bureaucracy. Having said that, they were fairly moderate ideas because they were imbued with the positions and power and privilege that they had, and this belief in the kind of all-powering position of the Tsar. And a similar kind of message was reinforced by the church. So the Russian Orthodox Church had taught that social and political systems in Russia had been decided by God, that nothing should be done or could be done to change it. And in the church services, the priest would tell the congregation that the Tsar had been chosen by God, and therefore to go against the Tsar was to go against God. And as a God-fearing nation, these things had an incredibly powerful effect on the Russian people. And this kind of entrenched in the Russian psyche led to a contribution towards Russia being very conservative socially, very backward in a lot of its ideas, and this impacted on the Russian economy as a whole as well. So we're seeing different methods of control. So the nobility would help the Tsar's control, the church would help the Tsar's control. And then we've got the real instruments of control. So we've got the army. Now, the Russian Empire had been expanding, and I'll look at that in more detail in another video when I look at the Crimean War, where that kind of expansion comes to a kind of juttering halt. And the army had played a role in expanding the Russian Empire, but it also played a role in crushing internal opposition. The Russian army was gigantic. It was the biggest in the world. It was run by the nobility, not all of whom were necessarily very good military leaders, but were firm supporters of the Tsar. The ordinary soldiers were conscripts from peasant families. They were from a group in Russian society known as serfs, and they were obliged to stay in the army if they were called upon to do so by their local lord on behalf of the Tsar. There's one special group in the army, which are the Cossacks, who were renowned as some of the world's greatest horsemen, and they made up a very prestigious part of the army, and also the Tsar's own personal bodyguard. Right, the more sinister stuff going on behind the scene is the secret police, known at this stage as the Third Section, and their job was to make sure that the state was secure. And they would oppress any opposition to the Tsarist system, and they carried out surveillance, and they ensured very strict censorship, again, preventing any other ideas or any opposition from growing. They censored any reports of what was going on in Western Europe, particularly anything that came out about political reforms that were going on. They censored any criticism of social conditions in Russia, and a lot of those social conditions were really, really dire. They checked literature for any dangerous ideas or what they deemed to be dangerous ideas. They were shadowing about 2,000 individuals who they believed had anti-Tsarist feelings. And they arrested any opponents of the Tsar thought to be radical and potentially dangerous. And they would either be imprisoned or exiled into parts of the Russian Empire with extreme weather conditions, or out of the Russian Empire altogether. So the Tsar's control of what was going on, this power of his autocracy, was imposed through religion, it was imposed through social order, and it was enforced by force by the army and by the Third Section. Right, so the political conditions in Russia, well, some of these are quite mind-blowing, really. There had been thought of reform, and then there was a military uprising, an armed uprising in December 25 against Tsar Nicholas I. And he, from that point, really used repression to keep order. Russia, at this point, starts to really distance itself from the West, and the Tsar's sort of Western ideas as dangerous, especially following things like the French Revolution. And that this is an important trend in Russia, where kind of a Russian way of doing things, a non-kind of anti-Western way of doing things, is a really ingrained part of Russian culture, going back to the Tsarist period, but something we'll see continue through the communist era, and something you might see kind of echoes of even today. Now, the Russians believed that their culture was superior to all others, most notably superior to the culture of the other nationalities living within the Russian Empire, and their kind of culture and way of doing things was often repressed by the Russian authorities, and this is something we'll see continued beyond 1855, particularly under one of the future Tsars, Alexander III. There was very tight censorship, as already mentioned, and that was all controlled by the third section. And really, it was only when Russia loses in the Crimean War that there starts to be this kind of movement towards a degree of reform, as they start to see that maybe their system isn't the best and isn't the most powerful. Right, the social conditions. There's some stuff in here that is absolutely horrendous, and hence you've got my angry picture up above. So there's a really strict social hierarchy. The majority of the Russian population were known as serfs, and essentially this is a form of slavery. They could be bought and sold. They needed permission to marry. They could be beaten. They could be conscripted into the army. About half of them belonged to private landowners, and about half of them belonged to the state. Those who belonged to the state would live in village communes known as mirs, and they would be controlled by the village elders. There were some urban artisans, skilled workers, there were some manufacturers, there were some merchants, but one thing that's notable about Russia is that actually the middle class was absolutely tiny, particularly considering the size of the population. And so your class actually was based on birth. Social mobility was even limited by law. So whilst you might see a degree of social mobility in other countries around this point in history, you aren't seeing it in Russia. Now, this is the bit that really gets me. It is utterly bizarre. The group of people who paid taxes in Russia were serfs, urban workers, and tradesmen. Nobility, the wealthiest people in the country, paid no tax. They just collected it from others. And the clergy paid no tax. So you got this really bizarre situation with a regime where the money comes from the poorest people and the richest people don't contribute anything. They don't contribute any work, really, in most cases, and they don't contribute in terms of taxes either. Right, now one of the bits that's really important when thinking about the Russian Empire in terms of its society is to not make the mistake of thinking everybody was Russian. In fact, about 55% of the population was Russian, about 22% of it was Ukrainian, about 8% of it was Polish, and then we've got Belarusians, Jews, Tatars, Finns, Germans, Georgians, Armenians, Romanians, Estonians, Iranians. There were, again, there's a big list on there, and even that's not all of them. So it is an incredibly diverse place, Russia. Now, the economic conditions are a bit of a disaster as well. Russia is really economically backwards in 1855. It's really, really rural. So whilst in Russia, 11 people lived in villages for every one that lived in towns, in Britain, it was 2 to 1. So you can see that Russia is still a lot more rural, still a lot more agricultural. Now, part of the problem in Russia is a lot of the land was inhospitable, wasn't good agricultural land. A lot of it is very, very far north. It is very cold. Also, there was issues with the size of the empire in terms of communication, and travel was made really difficult. Now, Russia actually exported food and had reserves of timber, coal, oil, and gold. So economically, it's not all disastrous, but they don't fully utilize their resources, so they aren't making the best of what they've got. And part of the reason for that is there is very, very little private enterprise. There are not really any market forces, as most of economic activity is either done at a subsistence level or at a barter level. So the landowners get what they want, kind of grown and made for them by the local serf population. The serf population get basically just about enough to survive, and therefore they don't have money to go and buy things. The landowners don't really have any incentive for setting up kind of capitalist style industry because they have a very comfortable lifestyle based on the work of their serfs. And the agriculture they're actually carrying out, I was going to say being agricultural is not necessarily completely a bad thing, but they were still using things like strip farming, where families would have strips of land that would be dotted around, normally a 3-field system around the village. There was a complete lack of modern machinery. There was a lack of fertilizers. And so the Russian agricultural industry was miles behind that of Western Europe and was very, very inefficient. And again, when we go and look at the Crimean War in a future video, then we'll see that this kind of stuff all comes back to haunt Russia. that it is a long way behind, and it's coped up until this point as one of the great powers, but it isn't going to be able to sustain that as economic growth and development is really taking off in Western Europe. Right, thank you very much for watching. Please remember to like, to share, and to subscribe. Check out the other videos on Russian history and on our various other bits. We've got some American history, we've got some Tudor history, and we're going to have some more modern stuff coming as well. There's also loads of politics and stuff on here as well. Thank you very much for watching. Stay tuned. There'll be more to come on Russia. Thank you very much.